This is a global story. It's a global story with Mississippi at its heart. And it's not just a story of war or the bravery, the determination, the self-sacrifice that war breeds. It's really a love story. It's a love story between Jackson and the Dutch.
So it's May of 1940. Nazi Germany has already invaded and conquered Poland, and now they're set to invade France. And they go through the Netherlands and Belgium, which were both neutral at that time.
Well, the Netherlands had hoped to remain neutral in World War II, as they had in the First World War. And they may have been able to had it been a similar war to the First World War.
And the Dutch fight valiantly for 5 days, but unfortunately the Germans have them outnumbered and outgunned and outmanned. And the Dutch are forced to surrender, particularly after the horrific bombing of Rotterdam.
Rotterdam was bombed very heavily, terror bombing as it was called, where thousands and thousands of civilians were slaughtered in this firebombing of Rotterdam by the Luftwaffe. Most of the Netherlands fighting forces, their air force at the time was decimated, their army was imprisoned. The Navy, strangely enough, was able to escape almost unscathed to fight another day in the Netherlands East Indies.
So the Queen and the royal family, along with senior government officials, flee to London, where they set up a government in exile. In 1942, the Dutch colony, the Netherlands East Indies, was attacked by the Japanese. Now, the Dutch had had a foothold in the East Indies since the 17th century. First, they were there as traders, and then later on it became a full-fledged colony.
Well, like the Germans, the Imperial Japanese had their own expansionist ambitions in the Asian sphere, not only on the Asian continent, but also, of course, in the Pacific Ocean and in Micronesia.
And it was very rich in natural resources, particularly oil, which the Japanese coveted for its war machine.
It was very common at the time for the Dutch men to go and sort of make their fortunes in the East Indies. They would go from the Netherlands, go to the East Indies, stay there for 6 years, make a lot of money, and then on that 7th year take a sabbatical, go back to the Netherlands, visit their families.
My family went to Indonesia, Java in those days. And we went there without my father because my father had become a pilot for KLM, and he went by plane, and the family, my mother and 4 children, had to go by boat. So in September 1938, we were on the Christian Huygens, a passenger boat, for 6 weeks, and arrived in Batavia.
I was born in Indonesia, in Batavia, on the 18th of September 1941. Well, the first months were fantastic, of course. I mean, it was a colonial time.
I was born in Java in a small place called Tegal. My parents were people that had come from Holland. My father worked as a forester for the Netherlands East Indies government.
My parents moved to Java. Java was a big area for the colonial people, and most people were living there. And we had 3 big cities there: Bandung, Batavia, and Surabaya.
I was born in the Dutch East Indies, in central Java, and in a little place called Sragen. We moved quite often. You know, we moved from Sragen, central Java to East Java. My father died in East Java. We went to the Celebes, another island, and I went to school there. And finally, I was at school in Bandung when the war broke out with Japan in December 1941.
My parents lived in Medan, Sumatra, but when my mother was expecting me, she got ill with malaria, and the doctor said that she had to go to a cooler climate. So she went back to the Netherlands and she stayed with her family in Leiden, and I was born there.
The fate of the Netherlands East Indies was sealed even before the Battle of Java began. After the fall of Sumatra, Churchill pulled all British forces out of the area.
And so that really left Java open to the Japanese, who then quickly invaded and conquered the East Indies.
Well, when the war broke out with Japan, we were all called up in the military service. We were drafted, as they call in America, drafted. And so that is when we joined the military Air Force in January 1942.
The Japanese were already in Malacca, as it was called then. It's now Malaysia. So my husband and all those boys were called up for the Air Force, and they got their training in Java, in Tasikmalaya.
I started flying half a year before the invasion, when the Japanese started moving through Bangkok and Singapore. Then it was obvious that we had to finish our training as fast as we can.
I joined the military 1 week after Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese invaded Java, I was on board of a ship called the Boissevin.
So they grouped us together from the Vlieger Corps in the 4 or 5 cities and put them on a ship, the Boissevin, and we went to Australia. And we were immediately put in the flying school there, and they were had instructions to get us ready for combat.
We were called up to join the Air Force, and we had the training, part of the training in Australia, short time, 2 months, and then we went to the United States, Jackson, Mississippi.
Gerrit Gratian, a Dutch airman, his wife Jopie was actually one of the few Dutch wives that was able to escape.
We women were not allowed to go with our husbands because they said, well, when they have finished their training, they will come back. But we, of course, we knew that the time was so short, as the Japanese were already in Malaysia. I escaped, luckily. And on our way to the harbor, the Japanese came flying over and they were shooting people, and we got out of the taxi and went into the ditch, and when the planes were gone, we went on with the taxi and we went to the harbor, Tanjung Priok.
Now, the Dutch, they were practical, did not call for a mass evacuation. They were focused on getting skilled personnel out. Pilots, particularly government officials, those type of people who could lead the fight from exile.
Many of the military personnel were evacuated from Australia, but there wasn't enough time or space on the transport ships or aircraft to evacuate the civilians. So they stayed behind to enter into the Japanese occupation. But the Dutch flyers were part of this group that was evacuated to Australia, and they were comprised of aviators from the Netherlands East Indies Army as well as the Royal Netherlands Navy.
The military tried to get out as much as they could, saying they were essential, and the rest were put in camps, and they had camps for men and for women separate. And the women also had all the children below 12 years of age.
So they arrive in Australia hoping to set up a flying school to complete their training.
Unfortunately, lack of adequate training facilities and a shortage of materials, and of course a fear of a Japanese invasion of Australia itself, forced the Dutch to begin looking for other places to train.
We were in training in Parafield, which is an airfield to the north of, on the north of Adelaide, by train to Melbourne, went on board the ship the Mariposa of the Medicine Line, and went by ship to San Francisco.
The Dutch boarded a ship, the Mariposa, in Australia, and from there they sailed to San Francisco. And there were almost 700 Dutch men, women, and children on board, because some of the Dutch had been able to smuggle their families out of the Indies.
I first got the primary training in Fort Leavenworth, and later on the basic and advanced training in Jackson, Mississippi.
The United States Army granted the Dutch the use of Sherman Field at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for primary training. The Dutch were there until October, until it became too cold for them to continue operating their training in these open cockpit aircraft.
But when the winter started, we had to put so many clothes on that it was impossible to fly. And then we asked to be moved to Jackson, Mississippi, where the other people already had established themselves.
Well, we had a training, a flying training. It was a very big base, and all the Dutch pilots were trained in Jackson, Mississippi.
We started the primary training with a Fairchild trainer. And later on, the basic training was with a Vultee. Advanced training was with the Harvard, and operational training was with the P-40. The plane I liked most was the Harvard.
A lot of these young men talk about that as soon as they got here, they felt this huge welcome. I mean, one of the first things that took place was a parade.
The Dutch arrived here on May 8, 1942, and there were over 500 of the men, as well as some families, and so they got here in the middle of the night. So the city of Jackson woke up the next morning, and it was a relatively small city at that time with 60,000 citizens. So you had a huge influx of these 500 good-looking guys, and this just set the city abuzz. They were the talk of the town.
It was in May of 1942, May the 8th. We were driving in a carpool. We got to the entrance of the air base and saw these tall, good-looking guys, tan, blonde, with shorts and knee socks on. And they looked, we'd just never seen anything like that before.
Now, of course, with Jackson's own sons off to war, these Dutch airmen found themselves in a city full of available young women, and USO dances were arranged, and many of the very outgoing, more outgoing cadets soon found themselves with dates.
Well, the people I was around mostly, they loved them. They were very nice. Their manners were wonderful. They had wonderful manners.
So the Dutch were very popular with the local women, of course. You can imagine they were tall, handsome, foreign, with interesting accents. And we've also heard that they had very nice manners and were very well educated, as well as being one of the highest paid servicemen of the Allied forces. So they had money to spend on their girlfriends.
I was walking up the Capitol Street, and I saw these four gentlemen coming down, and some of them had on shorts, and some of them had on winter clothes, and some had on long, I guess it was their uniform, but from Java it was a different kind. And I thought, gee, that's a strange looking group of boys. Where are they from?
Well, my first sight of seeing them was sitting on my porch here in Jackson on Tom Vivica Street, when several of them were coming down to pick up their days down the street from where I lived. And that was my first time to know that we had Dutch flyers at the air base here. Their uniforms were different. And of course, then young girls looked at the uniforms.
You have to understand that these Dutch were refugees, so when they got here, originally when they got here, they were in all manner of uniforms, Canadian Navy, British Navy uniforms, British Army uniforms, Australian Army uniforms, random Dutch Army uniforms, just all manner of things. So you had men who not only looked different from the American trainees, but also looked different from each other, and certainly would have drawn a lot of attention.
I was working at a little drugstore there across the street from the Y, and all the Dutch boys would go to the Y during the day, I guess, to bathe or to exercise. I don't know. Maybe they had something there. So while I was working there, some of them would come over to have a sandwich and a Coke or something to drink, and that's the way I met my first husband, Leo.
The people there were very friendly, and the girls that they meet having our milkshakes and so on, they often suggested we come home to their home on the weekend. They would put on a barbecue, and that was very nice.
So these families took it upon themselves, the whole city of Jackson really, and the state took it upon themselves to be, saw it as their patriotic duty to be welcoming and hospitable to these men.
Jackson was a very nice place, and what I liked so much were those beautiful style houses they had, the southern style houses with the big porches and the big pillars, and the governor's house, and it was a very nice place.
The food was a surprise to us, and we liked it very much, and it was very abundant.
Our spare time we spent, of course, outside, and we mingled with the American girls, etc. You see, they had a car. In the Dutch East Indies, we didn't have cars for us. Our parents had cars, but the young people didn't have cars. And there in America, they had their own car. It was something special.
Well, I worked after school at Walgreens down on Capitol Street. And that was the place where the Dutchmen came every afternoon and on the weekends.
I lived in Jackson in St. Charles Avenue. We had rented a house together with Ron and Nan Hoekstra. So the four of us lived in Jackson. We had very nice American neighbors. Everybody was very friendly.
We liked the girls in back. They were very hospitable and friendly, and they loved to be recognized from a distance.
They knew how to treat a lady. Opened the car doors for her. Pulled out the chair for you. They just were very nice.
And so many of them attended dances as well as going out in groups and going on dates. And so romance blossomed fairly quickly after they arrived.
We just hit it off real good. And I liked him. And we kind of fell in love. And it kind of grew a little bit. And this was in 1943, in the summer of 1943 that I met him. And we were married in first part of December.
It was at a birthday party for another Dutchman at the rotisserie. And there were a lot of us at a long table, and he sat directly across from me. And he was entertaining everybody around and just seemed to be very interesting type.
Jackson celebrated his first wedding between a local girl and a Dutch officer on September 12, 1942 at Galloway Memorial Church, in what was called at the time one of the outstanding events of the fall season.
And some of these weddings were secret because the Dutchmen were supposed to request permission from headquarters before they married. But that didn't always happen, and we know of several women, local women, that were married in secret nuptials.
We decided we wanted to get married, but you had to get permission from the officer that took care of that. But because of our age, he decided not to give us permission.
So he went and got licensed. I didn't know at that time that he was supposed to have a permit from the government to be married. And he went and his friend bought license and at the courthouse, and a friend of his and my girlfriend, they went with us and we got married there in Brandon.
So we got married without permission. This is a true story.
The Dutch flyers are still remembered today as daredevils. They like to fly under telephone wires. They even flew under the Mississippi River Bridge at Vicksburg. They buzzed sunbathing girls at Liberty Park and flew really low down Capitol Street. So they took risks, and unfortunately, sometimes those risks were fatal.
One pilot actually suggested it had more of a psychological origin. He said that the Dutch themselves felt emasculated, that they had been run out of their homes by the Germans in Europe and then run out again by the Japanese out of their colony in the Netherlands East Indies, and that they felt that they had something to prove. And that to prove that, they did all of these very dangerous stunts.
There were a couple of people that lost their lives in accidents, and usually accidents which were caused by themselves, stupid actions.
It was usually people taking unnecessary risk in flying, and low flying, and trees and things like that.
We had quite a few accidents in Jackson, Mississippi. A good friend of mine, his name is Roy Van Pelt, he's also in the book. He died with an accident in America. And then another one had an accident during night flying close to Jackson, Mississippi, died there. A third one had an accident showing off to the girls and making slow rolls, and so, you know, and he had an accident and died also.
27 men were killed in training accidents during their time here. And not all of those accidents were pilot error. Sometimes it was because of bad weather or mechanical or engine failure.
I had a couple of accidents, but not because of stupidity, just technical defaults.
Serious?
Rather serious accidents I made with a P-40, an old P-40. I made a crash landing near Jackson.
My husband had his training there, and he had night flights. And one evening, my daughter was not yet 1 year old, because there was an air crash with a night flight. One evening, I was used to him going away after dinner and coming back at 10 or 11 o'clock in the evening. And one evening at 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and there were two people standing in front of the door, Frederik and Ernestine Kalkoen. And they didn't. I opened the door and I said, "Are you crazy to visit me at this hour of the evening, so late?" And well, they didn't say anything, and I felt something had happened. And then they told me that the airplane crashed. They took off and they flew straight into the top of the trees at the end of the runway. And my husband was killed, and Captain Johnsons was killed, and an American flyer. There were 3 men on board, and they were all 3 killed. So then we had this funeral in Jackson, Mississippi, where my husband is buried. And well, I must say that the Americans made also a very, very nice job of when somebody got killed. Very, very impressive. Very impressive.
Later on, that cemetery, not only was it ceded to the Dutch, but it was actually declared Dutch soil. In 1943, a monument was erected, a monument designed by one of the pilots that was here, was erected there at Cedar Lawn in honor of these fallen men who died in training accidents. Ambassador Loudon, who was the Dutch ambassador to the United States at the time, later said of the American government or of Jackson ceding this land to the Dutch government, so that the conveyance of the land really cemented the alliance between the Netherlands and the United States, and would forever show our friendship and our commitment to freedom and to fighting evil throughout the world. When the Japanese invaded Java, Dutch men were almost immediately interred and put to work repairing damage done during the invasion. Dutch women and children of full-blooded Dutch women and children were soon thereafter rounded up and put into concentration camps.
My mother and, in the meantime, 5 children, because I had a little sister in 1941, were staying at a tea plantation in the mountains south of Batavia, part of the Puncak.
Unfortunately, after a couple of months, the Japanese discovered that was a good spot to have an outpost there, I mean, a lookout. And so they discovered my mother and the 5 children, and we were brought down to Java, to Batavia again. And we were put into a camp, Japanese camp.
The Japanese found us because I remember they came with a number of trucks and they occupied the tea factory. And eventually they found us too, and we were put on trucks and transported back to Bandung.
We talked with Leonie Lang, who was a young woman at the time of the Japanese invasion of the Indies, and her brother, Harry Lang, had actually come to Jackson to train with the Dutch Flyers, and he married a Mississippian, Lois Lang. But Leonie was soon interned by the Japanese, along with her mother, and her father was interned in a different camp. And she suffered through 3 terrible years in the camps with never enough food, and she saw countless atrocities.
Later on they changed it when we were in Banyu-Biru, that is Camp 10. That was a real jail where they put us in. And the situation was very, very bad there. We had about 3,000 something people in there. Oh, and I tell you, that is the worst thing. The worst thing what can happen to you, no medicine. They let you die, no medicine. And my mother got sick and she had to go in the hospital there and no medicine. My mother died July the 27th. I found later on from the Red Cross that my father died in 1944 already.
But my mother had died of malnutrition, and she got ill, and you know you don't get medicines from the Japanese, so she just died of exhaustion and malnutrition.
The Japanese interned over 70,000 Dutch people in the Indies, and life in the camps was brutal. There was never enough food or clothing or medicine, and any step out of line meant a beating or torture or even death. So many people died in the camps, and you can just imagine the Dutch Flyers here in Mississippi, they knew that their loved ones were in these camps with the Japanese, and they didn't know if they were dead or alive because there was no communication.
My family was in Java, and they were later interned and taken in custody by the Japanese. I didn't see them until the end of the war in 1945. There was no contact at all.
I didn't even know my family was in concentration camps because there was no news. I didn't know anything about what had happened. I only learned about that after the war.
My mother and 2 sisters were then put into concentration camps. There was no contact whatsoever, no, not a word.
And Indonesians were told by that time, by the Japanese, that they would get freedom and independence the moment that they could leave. So the Indonesians started siding, of course, with the Japanese. And At the other side, we had a lot of Indonesians that are very pro-Dutch, and they smuggled food and other things through the fence at night so that they could eat better and pass messages from one camp to the other.
The Japanese had taken over an orphanage that had 400 children in the orphanage, and Jan's parents took care of the children in their own home during those years.
The concentration camp was part of the town Bandung. They put a fence around it and kicked out all the people that lived in it, that were usually Indonesian people, or Dutch, and that they had to stay.
They took the 10-year-old boys, or 10, 11 years away from the mothers. That they didn't allow it, you know, they took them away and put them in man camps. I still hear the kids screaming and yelling, they didn't want to go, you know. They put them in a truck and gone.
And my brother, who had become 11 in Bandung, was taken away because as of 11, young little boys had to be joined with the internees and prisoners of war of men only.
Until I think 1944, we stayed in Chihabit. Then we were put on the train. Took us 24 hours back to Batavia, and we were put in a horrible camp, Chideng, which was known for a horrible commander.
One year I was working with the elektriciteitsmaatschappij.
The electrical company?
Electric company, and we had to come at the office every day, Sunday too. And they didn't trust me, my blue eyes and my blonde hair. And so they took me at the table with a great poster for my ears, for my eyes. And at the poster was Awas Mata Mata Musuh. In Nederlands, wacht u voor de vijand. Blue eyes.
Behold for the enemy.
Behold for the enemy. And that is, I did it for 9 or 10 months, every day. And I can tell you that you will be crazy of that. You didn't work, only looking at the poster all day long, Sunday too.
So my mother and 4 children were in the Chideng camp, and that's where we spent the last part of the war. There was not much to eat. You had to buy it if you had money. If you didn't have money, you had to go to the we call it the gaarkeuken. It was a common kitchen, and in the kitchen. Everybody had to assist in cleaning and cooking and whatever happens in the kitchen.
The prisoners were fed very little, usually starch, cooked in water with maybe a little bit of vegetable. We were told that if you could find a piece of meat in the soup of starch, that you were very lucky.
And I remember the food. I mean, it was horrible. This gooey sago porridge we had to swallow. It tasted like glue. And I remember also going through the sewerage system with my brothers and sisters. Then we could go out of the camp and to look for food.
And my stepfather was toen, he had to go to the Kempitij. Do you know the Kempitij?
Yeah, secret
the
police.
Kempitij, and they murdered him. And after that, was I at the Kempitij. After a fortnight, I have to go to the Kempitij, and it was a terrible time.
Some of the prisoners have told us that it was almost a mixed blessing. They knew the Allies were winning because the Japanese were treating them more harshly.
If the Japanese is losing, They beat you up. They know that they are so angry you cannot do nothing is wrong. And we know that they are losing the war, you know, because, oh God, they put the punishment on us. And one boy was asking me, he said, Lenny, do you know where my mom is? I tell you the truth, I didn't have the strength to tell him that his mother died and his little sister together, because there was no medicine for him.
The Royal Netherlands Military Flying School lowered its flag over the Jackson Army Air Base in February 1944. Most of the men went to relieve and reinforce those already fighting in Australia against the Japanese, but a few were sent to London to fight with the RAF.
Among the men transferred to Europe was Jan Helfrich, and he was assigned there with 5 other Dutchmen to fly carrier aircraft with the British Fleet Air Arm, and these 6 men became known as the 6 Flying Dutchmen.
They all graduated together, left here at the same time, and they were in a squadron attached to the British Fleet Air Arm. And they stayed together all during the war and saw quite a bit of action. They flew cover for part of the invasion of France, and then later they were in Norway looking for the Tirpitz.
The German battleship Tirpitz was a massive dreadnought the Nazis had moved into the North Sea to deter an Allied invasion of Norway and harass British ships trying to resupply the Soviets.
And I think they damaged the ship. I don't know if they sunk it, but they helped find it anyway. And they saw quite a lot of action.
Helfrich's flight was not successful in taking out the Tirpitz, but sorties like his forced the Germans to run constant repairs, effectively rendering the battleship a floating turret until it was finally sunk by Lancaster bombers in November 1944.
When they were in the British aircraft carrier was in the GNC, and they were bombing around that area, and he was shot down on Mount Olympus. The plane had crashed, but thankfully he was okay. The Greek peasants in the mountains took care of him, and a few weeks later he escaped on a donkey down the mountainside and finally got back to the carrier and was able to, by the time he'd gotten back, they had divided all his clothes. So he had to go around and get all his things back from the other guys.
Hitler was dead, and the Nazi war machine was destroyed. The world could finally turn its full attention to bringing an end to the threat of the Imperial Japanese.
I want to go to Australia because from there on we would be attacking Indonesia.
And we went back to Australia for the Royal Australian Air Force.
When the training was finished, we were transferred to San Francisco, where after a rather short time, I think about a week, we were transferred on board of a Liberty ship, which crossed the Pacific to Australia, where we landed, I think, in Brisbane.
And in Brisbane, we had Canberra, which was our main base in Australia. And we stayed in Canberra. From Canberra, we were sent by the Royal Australian Air Force to Morocco, New Guinea.
Before we went to Morocco, we were transferred to a potshot on the northwestern coast of Australia, because people were afraid that the Japanese would invade.
They were anticipating, or they were afraid for a Japanese landing craft that would invade Australia from the west.
Invasion that the Japanese were initially planning to occupy Australia, and they had the fleet out off the east coast of Australia, and the west coast was Morro Bay.
We were sent to the west coast to fight against them, but it didn't happen. It didn't materialize.
Australians got a beating on both fronts, inland and at the ocean. So they withdrew what they had left, and America started playing a major role in the reoccupying things.
The men in Australia were split into two units. There was the 120th Squadron, which flew P-40 fighter planes, and then there was the 18th Squadron, which flew B-25 bombers. Now, the 18th Squadron was stationed in Batchelor Airfield, which was in northern Australia, and they flew missions against Japanese shipping as well as land targets in the South Pacific. And they were really extraordinarily successful. They earned the nickname the Dutch Cleanser because they literally cleaned the seas of Japanese ships. And they flew over 2,400 sorties during the war.
And we got the good planes, the P-40N, for the first time in Australia, which was much better and responded quite well.
You see, the main thing that we were in Morocco for was to guard the entrance between the passage between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, which would be between New Guinea and North Australia.
There are two flights which I remember in particular. One was a raid on Doom Island, in which a friend of mine was shot down, and I gave him air cover until he was rescued. And the second was a raid which we flew on an airfield, a Japanese airfield, in which we sustained very severe losses, and I was shot down and made an emergency landing in the ocean. I was in a bit of a stress because I did not know exactly whether a bomb which I was supposed to deliver on that airfield but had not gotten off, whether the bomb was still underneath of the aircraft, but everything went fine. It was the most perfect ditching I ever made. A shark came to visit me when I was floating in the ocean in a dinghy, and I just shooed it away, more or less, by shouting at it and hitting it with a paddle. Yes, it went away. I was rescued by an air sea rescue aircraft, which was a Catalina.
And then after Morocco, we went to Biak, which was the main assembly line of the American Air Force in the north of New Guinea. And then we were in Biak where the atom bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were dropped, and then the wars ended.
The Dutch had fought for 5 years to reclaim their homeland, the Netherlands, as well as the Netherlands East Indies. And tragically, only a few days after the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the Indonesian nationalist Sukarno declared independence, and soon the country dissolved into chaos. There were countless atrocities committed. Indonesians were killing Dutch people and any Europeans and Chinese they saw.
The Indonesians were fighting the Dutch, and the Japanese was having to fight the Indonesians to keep them from killing the Dutch. It was crazy, and the British had sent over several hundred military people to take care of us, to defend us.
But in the meantime, they commanded the Japanese troops to actually keep the peace.
The Japanese had to protect us because the Japanese were fighting to us. We knew it.
In those days, we were guarded by the Japanese against attacks of Indonesian, let's say, freedom fighters, or whatever you call them.
And they were just killing the Dutch and Americans as we came in. As the planes would fly in, and just as they would land, They'd get off the plane to come to the office, into the hangar there. They'd shoot them and kill them all. That was the Indonesians. The Japanese was taking care of the Dutch then, and it was terrible. It was really just terrible. And we were just lucky that when we got there, it had kind of quietened down some, you know. And they were taking babies and throwing them up and catching them on these bamboo poles, the sharp bamboo poles. Oh God, it was just miserable. We never did know what we were going to be next, you know, because they were everywhere.
Sukarno was more of a moderate, and he was really concerned with the world's opinion of the conflict. So he was able to unite those warring factions in Indonesia.
Then, you know, what really upset me while we were there, the American ship came in, the Navy came into port, and then I found out what the reason they were there was to witness Sukarno getting his independence from the Dutch. I thought, well, how crazy was the United States? Here is the richest little island in the world, and America could have taken it, but they gave it to Sukarno. Sukarno didn't have the knowledge to run a place. He was just, he had been in exile or in prison for a while himself, and and Americans had to be there to witness, to make sure that the Dutch signed it over, the island over to the Indonesians. I was kind of mad with my own country.
Unfortunately, the Dutch felt betrayed by their allies. They had very little, with such a small fighting force, they had very little clout to influence an indifferent American government and an Australian government that had already expressed a anti-colonial sentiment.
Eventually, the Dutch granted the Indonesians independence in 1949.
Actually, all the people from Dutch East Indies felt themselves abandoned by Holland. Not too surprising, because Holland had its own problems in those days.
And we had nothing. And we came here in Holland and we had nothing. But there were so many people who had nothing that it viel niet meer op.
Nobody noticed.
Nobody knows, yes.
And then, of course, they started eliminating all the Dutch. They'd go kill the Dutch. So Harry and them had to go on, well, what do you call it, on flight to shoot them, kill them. And Harry was a tail gunner on the B-25, so he was shooting them down, going and coming, you know, because they'd fly over and they'd kill anyone they saw out there with a gun, because they knew that they were there to kill them or to shoot them down. So he said, I said, did you kill a lot of people? He said, well, we had to. I said, you personally? He said, yeah, we had to, because they were there killing our people.
I saw my mother again after the war had ended in 1945. We could not go to the Dutch East Indies until about April, May 1946. And that is when I met my mother and my two sisters again in the Indies. And they stayed there for maybe a month, and then they went to Holland because life was not bearable in the Indies at that time.
And I was sitting just outside the gate of the camp, and there were more people there, but I was sitting there on some stone or whatever, and I saw this green car arrive, and the windows were open, and I recognized my father sitting in the car. So I jumped off whatever I was sitting on and dove right through the window and screamed, "Papi, Papi!" And I sort of stayed in the car, and he was, of course, flabbergasted that this is impossible. Lowakke, he always called me Lowakke. Not Lodewijk, but Lowakke. And you're alive, yes. Where is your mother? Where are your brother and sisters? And I said, okay, I'll show you. And we drove through the group of other people that were standing in the gate, and they were all asking my father, what is happening? What are you doing here? Can you help us? Because they were, of course, also desperate to know about the well-being of their husbands, if my father knew that.
Actually, when I saw him, I was scared stiff. He was a big man. I hid behind my mother's skirts, and I actually kept that for a very long time. That feeling I was scared of him because he was big, and because the Japanese are small, and I was not used to big men.
Then he took us, took some talking with the woman who was in charge of everything in the camp to get us out of the camp for just the evening, because my father would like to treat us to a good dinner in a restaurant in the center of Batavia. But he had to promise the lady that he would bring us back before 12 o'clock. That he never did.
They did leave a legacy because there are quite a few of their descendants around here, you know. Now my children are proud of their Dutch legacy.
So important that group, what they actually did. They were really very, very brave men.
It was just quite an experience and a big part of my life, and it still is a big part of my life because I've got two wonderful sons. They came from that. And I wouldn't change a thing about it.
He was a good man, and he was a brave man, and he was an excellent flyer and an excellent instructor.
In the 70 years since the Dutch lowered their flag over the Jackson Army Air Base here in Mississippi, the friendship between not only the Netherlands and the U.S., but particularly the Netherlands and Mississippi, and to put a finer point on it, the Netherlands and Jackson, has remained strong.
We know that Mississippi left a lasting mark on the Dutch flyers themselves because years later, many of them have chosen to be buried in Cedar Lawn Cemetery, even as recently as 2007 when Harry Lang was interred there. And so it was not only to be close to their comrades, to their brothers in arms, but I think partly it was also because when they were here during the war, they really felt like they were home. And I think it speaks very highly of Mississippi and our state and Jackson that 60, 70 years later, these men chose Mississippi. They wanted to rest here.